Hello, everyone. This is Stephen with Democracy Demythologized, where I talk with experts about different issues democracy faces around the world. Today, we're talking about U.S. military bases in Asia. The U.S. has a number of bases in Asia, also around the world, and they can kind of influence politics in local politics in complicated ways. So today, we're talking about the bases in Okinawa in Japan, also bases in the Philippines, and what people in these places think about the U.S. military and how it influences life on the ground. So in case you're wondering, right now I'm in the Philippines, which happens to be one of the countries we're talking about, in a place called Cebu. So I hope you enjoy. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Charmaine Willis. How are you doing today?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah, I like how you have a bit of like a kind of a wood theme behind you. And maybe, I mean, we're going to be talking, you do a lot of research on like US bases in Southeast Asia, which in my, if I had to like pick an element that I think of when I think of military bases, it's very much metal. That's probably the first like mental image I have. I mean, maybe even more something like an aircraft carrier, which is just like you look at every room is made of metal somehow. But like, so I guess that's kind of the opposite of a wood theme, but it's still cool to kind of see it behind you. But yeah, do you maybe want to talk about like what your background's in and the, you know, at a high level kind of what made you interested in researching bases in East Asia, US bases in East Asia?
Right. So I'm happy to. So currently I'm an assistant professor of political science at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. So as you mentioned, I study political science, but within that, really this focus on U.S. military bases in East Asia. I will say that my sort of starting point for this research in terms of going on as a scholar is really this focus on the particular region. I've been interested in East Asia for a really long time. This really started in Japan when I was, sort of funny story, when I was in college. I was first day of college, going to sign up for a language class. I just always loved foreign languages. I was going to take Spanish because that's what I had taken my whole life, basically to that point. And I met someone the first day who seemed like a really cool person. She said, "Oh, I'm going to take Japanese. Why don't you take Japanese with me?" So being sort of the impressionable 19-year-old I was at the time, I said, okay, sure. And so really I would say that interest in the region sort of spiraled from there. And additionally, like, you know, so many Americans, I really didn't have that much of a background in this particular region. We know it existed. We hear about World War II in Japan there, of course. We know about the Korean War, that sort of thing. But there's a lot of that history that we don't learn, at least in the American public school system. So sort of interested in expanding my knowledge there. I had that, as I said, from when I was an undergrad. And then I ended up going for my master's degree at American University in DC. They have a School of International Service, great program. I ended up studying the bases sort of as a result of something that happened when I was there. I was taking a class on South Korean foreign policy, and I was really interested in protests and civil societies, which are basically voluntary associations. There's a more political sciencey definition to them, but that's, you know, when you think about like NGOs and that sort of thing, that's what I'm talking about when I say civil society. And so I had to write an end of the semester project for this particular class. I wanted to compare South Korea and Japan. Wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, so I asked my instructor, and he said, well, why don't you think about writing about protests against U.S. military bases, because this is something that Japan and South Korea share. So I really hadn't thought about it until that time. And I think like so many Americans, I really had no idea about the fact that, we sort of know there's U.S. bases abroad, but we really don't think about how many there are, where they are, and sort of, the impacts of those sorts of things, and how people that have the bases in their community really feel about them. After that, I participated at American in an all-break student-led trip during winter 2010 that focused explicitly on this issue in Okinawa. So it was a really cool experience. We got to meet all these different stakeholders, politicians that are both Japanese, Okinawan, U.S. military officials. I think we had one member of the U.S. Department of State that we talked to, and then a lot of Okinawan activists and scholars as well. And then finally, when I went to do my PhD at the University of Albany, I had a lot of different topics that I was interested in researching, but base politics seemed to make the most sense given sort of the background I had and really sort of that area of focus.
Yeah, this is awesome. I mean, this is helpful to understand. I do agree with you. I think we in the U.S. we kind of only have a vague idea of the bases that are around the world.
Right.
I do for me personally, I remember reading a book by an anthropologist. That's my background. I'm an anthropologist. The book was called Base Nation.
Yep.
And I remember this one kind of put it on the radar. I was like, oh my gosh, there's actually the sheer magnitude and how many. And it seems like your research has often focused on or thought about how people in the communities in the countries where these bases are being built, how it impacts them. And the responses seem to be mixed. I mean, often the governments do invite the bases in, but many people, it seems like it can be very disruptive in many cases to their lives and to their livelihood, and to specific local communities. Yeah, I guess we've been talking a bit abstractly. Maybe the kind of the story of what we're talking about might make the most sense with an example. Do you want to talk about what's been going on with the Philippines, with the U.S. bases?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And as a sort of funny aside regarding what you just said, so the faculty advisor on this trip to Okinawa that we took was actually David Vine, who's the author of the book Base Nation. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate a lot of the work that a lot of really great anthropologists have done in this area, and it is a very interdisciplinary area, I would say, as well. So there's political scientists like me that are doing this work, but also sociologists, anthropologists as well. Yes, happy to talk about the Philippines. So the Philippines is one of the countries that I focused on in my research, along with Japan and South Korea and a few other countries we can talk about later. The sort of funny background to this in terms of how I got into the Philippines was that I really, as I mentioned before, focused on Japan and South Korea. These are countries I had a background in. When I went to get my PhD, my advisor at the time was a Southeast Asianist, so focusing on Southeast Asia, and she suggested, why don't you include the Philippines here? And I really didn't know much about it, but I said, okay, let me look into it. And I'm very glad that I did. It's in the dissertation. It will be in the book manuscript. I have a couple of articles I'm working on related to the Philippines in particular. But this case is very interesting for a lot of reasons. I would say the big thing when we think about the Philippines to consider, first of all, obviously the historical relationship between the Philippines and the U.S., which is, again, one of those stories we don't really learn in public school in the U.S., but as a result of the U.S. winning the Spanish-American War at the turn of the 20th century, the Philippines, along with several other territories like Puerto Rico, became part of the U.S. So it was actually a U.S. colony for a very long time. Obviously, World War II happened. It impacted the Philippines. There was Japanese occupation there as well. But we see the Philippines becoming independent of the U.S. in 1946. After it became independent, though, it did retain U.S. bases, so permanent U.S. bases. The really big bases during that time were the Subic Naval Base, which is in Olongapo, and then Clark Air Force Base, which I believe is in Angeles City. Both of these bases are on the main island of Luzon in the northern part. Obviously, Philippines is a big archipelago, so there's other bases, or there were at the time in the Philippines, but those are the biggest bases. And important to know that Subic in particular was the biggest U.S. naval base outside of the U.S. at that particular time. Mm-hmm. There was a protest movement in the Philippines in the late 1980s that resulted in basically new constitution, democratization, all these sorts of things. But along with that, what happened basically was then this new constitution, the Philippines said, we can't have permanent foreign bases in our country anymore. So after that time, the U.S. no longer had permanent bases in the Philippines. However, they had, I think, some troops in the country, and then finally we had what's called the Visiting Forces Agreement signed in the late 1990s that basically allowed the U.S. To operate there, to have troops in the country for temporary periods of time. And then in 2014, we saw the signing of what's called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, also known as EDCA, which has allowed the U.S. to use armed forces of the Philippines bases in the Philippines. We saw an extension of this in 2023. So as of now, there are 9 armed forces of the Philippines bases that the U.S. is allowed to have troops there. So this is sort of the big picture perspective in terms of what the U.S. basing presence looks like in the Philippines at present. It's not a permanent basing presence in the same way that it is in Japan and South Korea and a lot of European countries like Germany, but we do have access to several bases in the Philippines. Where are these bases located? You know, they are scattered around the country, but I will say 2 of the areas that I've traveled to for doing field work, which means I, go to the country, interview people, etc., are in the province of Palawan, which is a province that is right next to the South China Sea and the Spratly Islands. And then also Cagayan, it's a northern province that is, I think, probably the closest one to the Taiwan Strait. So in both of these provinces, there are 2 EDCA sites, as they call it, Armed Forces of the Philippines bases, where the U.S. is allowed to have military troops.
This is very interesting. So, it seems like the Philippines has a long history with the United States. Like you said, they used to be colonized by the United States. Since there can be a lot of special aspects to the relationship with the United States. I guess, and it also seems like they have a bit of a complicated relationship with China. And tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the U.S. bases are very much positioned to be kind of in the strategic chessboard against China, to be close to Taiwan, based off of all the stuff going on there, because that's a bit of a hotbed topic, and then also the kind of control as a naval power, control flow of things with China, and it seems like the Philippines have a bit of a love-hate relationship with China too, in recent politics. I guess how do the bases fare from in terms of Filipino politics, like in terms of how people, in your experience, in the Philippines, how do they conceive of these bases, and kind of where does it fit in with all their stuff going on?
Yeah, so there's a couple of key points to think about here. So first of all, when you think about what the U.S. is really doing in the Philippines, why it's there, I would say nowadays, I agree, the sort of, I think, main rationale here is really about deterring China. We know there have been clashes between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea. That is because they have competing maritime claims over territory and area there. As you mentioned, also there's the Taiwan Strait issue, and as I said, these bases that are in the northern province of Cagayan are also sort of well positioned to allow the U.S. If it wanted to actually bring, probably naval vessels up to the Taiwan Strait from that particular area. So a lot of it is about China, I would say. The other thing to note about this, when we saw the permanent bases close in the sort of early 1990s, we really didn't have the same tensions with China at that particular time. Also, if we think about early 1990s, this is of course the collapse of the Soviet Union and sort of the end of the Cold War at the time. So it's sort of a different security environment. We started to see tensions between China and the Philippines really start to ramp up in the 90s. So it's no accident really that we're starting to see these agreements between the U.S. and China starting to happen, U.S. and the Philippines starting to happen in the late 90s and then continuing with EDCA in 2014. So that tension has certainly been there. I will say what's really interesting also in the case of the Philippines, there was a study that was done in 2020, I believe, maybe 2019, that Mike Allen, Mike Flynn, Carla Martinez-Machin, and Andy Straubers put out this work. 2022 was when the book came out, Beyond the Wire, and basically they surveyed 14 host nations and trying to understand the impact specifically of contact between U.S. troops and civilians in these host nations and the impact that has on perceptions of the U.S. military there. And what was really interesting was, I think it was even the baseline that they found, out of these 14 countries that also included Japan and South Korea, the Philippines had the highest number of respondents saying that we have a positive perception of the U.S. military. And on the one hand, it's super interesting. On the other, I guess because of this history, it's not so surprising. We think about the U.S.'s alliances with countries or just relationships with countries in Southeast Asia. The Philippines has been really the country that has been sort of the most pro-U.S. historically, and I think that's still true today. Certainly, if you think about security, that alliance with the U.S. is crucial. We have U.S. military training, armed forces of the Philippines members, the infrastructure, the sort of hierarchy that's there is also modeled after what the U.S. does. We also have joint military exercises going on still, so that linkage is still really strong. Also, obviously, historically, the U.S. has provided economic development aid, so also in the area of economic development, there's been a pretty strong relationship. At the same time, to your point, I would say in more recent years, we've seen more economic exchange between China and the Philippines and more Chinese business and investment in the Philippines. I think it's also important to note that there's a pretty significant population of ethnic Chinese Filipinos in the Philippines as well. So there's this connection with China that's always sort of been there too. What's interesting as well, it's sort of hard to remember back to 2020, but as some may remember at this time, we had Rodrigo Duterte, who was the president of the Philippines at the time, and so he was sort of posturing, looking like he was going to have more of a, either not necessarily an alignment with either China or the U.S. or even more pro-China, and he sort of floated this idea of abrogating the visiting forces agreement. I think that's an important part of this. I'm not sure if I mentioned or if you heard the sort of the point that we also have a pretty, I can't give you the numbers, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but a fairly decent, I think, population numerically of, ethnic Chinese Filipinos that are there. And this is just to say that there have been historically strong connections with China and the Philippines in the past too, but is that in 2020, which is, hard to sort of put in everything. Um, we had Rodrigo Duterte as president. He had talked about abrogating the visiting forces agreement that the U.S. has with the Philippines, partially because, as some people are probably aware, he was sort of trying to strengthen, the Philippines' relationship with China, and I think just sort of generally having more options for the Philippines in terms of its alliances. That never happened. Obviously, the U.S. alliance with the Philippines has remained, and I think that's probably largely because of just these historical ties and also the ties between the armed forces of the Philippines and the U.S. military being really strong. Now we have President Bongbong Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is the son of the. This is to say that he is very pro-U.S., so we're not really going to see anything change in that regard anytime soon. With sort of the actions of the U.S. bases. So beyond saying that right now, positive, one of the key things that my interest is really about when we see these protests happening, this military or not. I mentioned this historical protest movement in the 1980s. We really haven't seen anything like that since the movement basically was somewhat successful, arguably, in terms of meeting its goals of getting the U.S., at least at that time. But we haven't really seen a sort of robust protest movement since then. One of the things that I argue in my work is that part of this is because of the nature of the bases that's really changed, especially in large parts of the Philippines, probably more visible now. That being said, we have seen protests at times. Claudia, I'm thinking about David Byrne. Her book, Base Towns, looks at this phenomenon that she calls disruption of the status quo, meaning we're seeing some kind of change in the nature of the basing presence. So when we saw, for example, the signing of the Visiting Forces Agreement, the signing of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, and then 2 years ago, the expansion of EDCA, we did see some protests, not, again, sort of the magnitude that we saw in the 1980s, but we did see some. And then, of course, what we see in the Philippines is similar to what we see in Japan, South Korea, and other places, where there's crime or accidents that are attributed to the U.S. military presence. We do see protests happening there as well. And I think the most recent case, or the most recent high-profile case related to crimes committed by U.S. military personnel happened in 2014 with the murder of Jennifer Laude.
What happened? What happened there?
In this particular case, Jennifer Laude was a trans woman who was in, I believe, the former Subic base area in Luzon, and she was murdered by a U.S. Marine. So we saw, as I said, a lot of activism around the incident itself, and then also we saw, protests in particular. When I say activism, that's what I'm referring to in this context. Regarding the actual trial, there was also protests regarding who was actually going to be able to hold the person that was accused of her murder. So sometimes there's agreements between the U.S. and the host nation partners about who actually gets to try and who gets to hold in custody people that are U.S. troops in particular that are accused of crimes. So this was one of those things that was a bit contentious in this particular case. And then the actual, I think, verdict, some people felt that it wasn't as stringent as it should have been. But so we saw protests happening around all those sort of facets of this particular case.
That's interesting. And just to be clear, was he tried within the Filipino government, or did the U.S. military insist on trying them within their own um, court mechanisms, I guess.
This is a great question. In this particular case, he was Pemberton is the Marine's name. He was tried in the Philippines, but that doesn't always happen, as your question sort of alludes to.
Yes.
I want to say maybe recently, like the past year or so, I think the rest of his sentence was commuted or something to that effect, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, this is interesting. I guess zooming a step back, I mean, my experience, it doesn't, what you're saying about the Philippines having a much more positive U.S. sentiment, based off of my experience traveling to all three countries, both Philippines, Japan, and South Korea, that doesn't surprise me. Like when I was there, it seemed to just have, many people just seem to have a much clearer, like, pro-US sentiment. And that could range from people having very positive takes about US colonialism, like a sense of like the Spanish, their colonialism, messed us up, and then the US colonialism, helped set us straight and helped build our institutions and helped us understand who we are, yada yada yada. But then, like, I do remember people, like, I remember, maybe this is a particularly good example, like, I remember somebody when I was there, he said, like, he's like, the US is our big brother savior. The US is the person that's they're coming to protect us from China, basically, was what he was arguing. And that they were, like, he was, I guess, specifically thinking about like a naval power, and he's like, our Navy isn't that big, and the US comes and kind of makes sure that we're doing okay. And I will say that, like, this is the bit of the anthropologist, like, when you visit a place, sometimes people with a certain, sometimes one perspective is much more likely to come talk to you. So, like, definitely a place here. So, like, people were much more, I think people who were pro-US, as someone from the US, they would be much more likely to, associate me with the US. So they would be much more likely to come talk to me about that. Whereas people who are more skeptical of the US might have been either less likely to talk to me or less likely to, like, bring it up in the same way. Also, a lot of people, and maybe this kind of, I think, hints at what you're talking about the rise of the bases over these last couple decades since the 90s. But, like, as a kind of a young adult, maybe in my 30s, as a white male American, I think many, I don't know most, but many people assumed I was a soldier hanging out on leave, right? I was on like a couple week leave, and I was just going to visit another part of the island. Like, in different countries, when I've traveled, people have different associations with me, but in the Philippines, that was a very common thing. So they might have also, like, assumed that I was from I was a part of that base, and that might have also influenced how they talked about with me. So just kind of giving a bit of the, that might bias the accounts that I receive. But I definitely would see like U.S. colonialism is good, and also they're helping us now by protecting us. What are your thoughts on this? Like, do you see this kind of thing in the research too? And do you see counter threads to this idea, or how do you see this kind of playing out with bases in the Philippines?
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. I would say, in terms of if they see, like a white American, what they would expect you to be doing there. It probably depends, to some extent on what part of the country you're in. There are, I think, as you mentioned in your questions for me, there are certainly some places that are more focused on tourism. actually Palawan that I mentioned, you have both these not explicitly bases. One of the places where we have access to is actually both an Armed Forces of the Philippines air base and also the commercial civilian airport in Puerto Princesa. So in this particular province, there's a lot of tourism, and I highly recommend it. I love Palawan. It's a great place. It's so beautiful. There's like scuba diving and all these great things. So there's a lot of tourism anyway, but then you also have the U.S. military presence there. So I could see in that place getting asked that question, but also people assuming that you maybe you're there for tourism. And I think there's other parts of Luzon, for example, where there's a lot of beaches and tropical places, and people might go there for other reasons. That being said, as I mentioned, there's some places where I think a lot of people would make that assumption that they can't understand why you're there except for being affiliated with the military. Like I mentioned, one of the places that I went to was in Cagayan, which is in the northern part of the Philippines, one of the northernmost provinces. And yeah, there's some beaches there, but that's not typically where foreigners come for relaxation, whatever. So in that place, I can imagine people having that sort of suspicion about why white American in particular is there. What I think is interesting too, the first thing I thought of when you mentioned this is sort of, this is sometimes something that comes out in my research in terms of my identity as a white American woman. But I've noticed, even when I'm talking to activists who are opposed to the U.S. military, not just in the Philippines, but other places, is they really make a point to say, oh, we don't hate Americans, we just don't like this particular thing. And I know part of that has to do with they're talking to me and saying this. And I certainly think too, in terms of what I've heard in the Philippines, and as you're saying, also the people willing to be interviewed by me. Part of it I do hear often is these people that are sort of more pro U.S., like sometimes journalists that have more of a neutral or sometimes more pro U.S. stance. And I can imagine activists or other people who I might be interested in talking to, sort of wanting to avoid interacting with an American, or maybe sometimes they're concerned about who I am and what I'm asking about. Am I actually affiliated with the U.S. military or U.S. government in some way? Which I'm not. But sometimes there's also that suspicion for me as a researcher as well.
Yeah, I mean, I that makes total sense. I would predict that. Yeah, as an anthropologist, it's like when you go around kind of asking people questions, you often get interpreted within the framework of who ask questions, or who of the people who look like you who ask questions. But yeah, I have found that, and for context, I guess I was mostly in Luzon, so like I was mostly in Manila and areas around Manila. But Manila was a place where people frequently thought I was a soldier. Also Cebu, which is not quite as like major touristy as Palawan, but it's pretty also gets a lot of tourists, I guess.
Right.
It might be the second most visited. I don't know. Maybe Luzon is the second, but like, so that could be it could be a factor. I mean, it is hard because there also were a lot of tourists. But also there were a lot of like, I also talked to a number of retired ex-soldiers in their like 40s or 50s, because you have to remember, in like there's something like the U.S. military, people can often retire in their early 40s if they want to. You can retire a lot younger, who've moved to the Philippines. That's a whole conversation to itself, I guess. But like for me personally, that was actually a bit of a struggle. I think it's hard. Like sometimes in other cultures, people struggle with their others when they encounter people who have a significantly different mentality than what they hold. And I think the irony is that somebody who's like very like, maybe this is a classical like kind of anthropologist or like academic kind of answer for social scientists, but like my other is someone who's like, yay to the US, they came and saved us, yay to colonialism, yay to this, because like these are things that I'm very used to not thinking about as good things, to say the least. But
Right.
like that was something I had to grapple with. It was like how can understand the perspective of people in this space, that are coming from a very different vantage point than where I'm coming from, even if at the end of the day I still might not agree with them. I still need to understand where they're coming from. Um, but yeah, zooming back out from that, how do you think the presence of these bases are playing out between like U.S. and China relations?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think in the case of the Philippines, I think first of all, the allowing of U.S. Basing access to these various armed forces of the Philippines bases is obviously a good signal from the U.S. perspective. We want to be able to have access to these, not only these bases in the Philippines, but specifically where these bases are located. I think, from a Chinese perspective, we might see this as, some kind of threat in some way. What are you actually intending on doing? Is this really a defensive thing, a deterrence thing, or are you actually, is the U.S. actually going to go out of Palawan, of Cagayan, and do something more aggressive? So I definitely can see it. To some extent, maybe escalating the tensions a bit, not only between the Philippines and China, but also perhaps even the U.S. and China as well. But again, keeping in mind that this is really, in terms of the U.S. Alliance with the Philippines, not really anything new. Pretty much the same old story as it's been regarding the closeness of that relationship since at least 1946. I think, related to what I mentioned earlier about Duterte, beyond his discussion of abrogating the Visiting Forces Agreement, I have also heard, and this relates, I think, a little bit about what you were talking about as well, some concerns about sovereignty over Filipino foreign policy, and wanting to have, an independent foreign policy, making policy decisions and decisions about what kind of relationships you want with other countries like China without as much U.S. Interference. So I think there's definitely some people that would say this was a concern for them. And the sovereignty issue, I would say, has sort of always been at the root of contention around the U.S.-based presence there, or at least one of the key things there. I also was thinking about this question, this claim or this concern that we sometimes hear about, okay, if you have, a U.S. base or a U.S. troop presence, does this make this particular community more likely to be the target of some kind of aggression from, some kind of enemy, basically, like in the eyes of the Philippines military and government, perhaps China? What we've seen in, of course, recent days in the Middle East, we've seen the bombing, for example, of a U.S. base in Bahrain. So those sort of things happening. I'm not saying this would happen to the Philippines necessarily, but it does sort of lend some, credence to this concern about how hosting a troop presence or a base might make this, community more likely to be the some kind of target of aggression, whether that's actually, bombing or something else. So I can certainly understand the concerns there as well.
Yeah, this makes sense. I guess, yeah, I mean, the Philippines, the U.S. has had a long relationship. I could understand concerns about the Philippines being able to kind of
Yeah.
define their own space more. But at the same time, um, it seems like it seems like at least many in the Philippines have gotten concerns about some of the kind of recent interactions with China and the islands, and that kind of might make them fall back into the U.S. a little bit because at least them in the U.S. have the strategic interest in that. But at the same time, China is also a major trading partner, so they are kind of walking the line between two powers. I guess that's kind of back to Cold War politics. It's like the classic third world problem. But yeah, this is common in Southeast Asia. But yeah.
I just wanted to make one other comment about this. I just thought of when I was there doing fieldwork initially in 2019. One of the people I interviewed was I would say a leftist scholar and someone who's definitely very critical of U.S. imperialism and with that U.S. basing presence in the Philippines and elsewhere. And I sort of asked why do we have a basing presence in the Philippines now when we had this movement against it in the 1980s that really wanted it gone, and now U.S. troops are back. And he said something to the effect of, "It's better the devil that you know," meaning we know what we're getting with the U.S. We don't necessarily know what we're getting in the case of China, specifically with security issues, not less about the economic side. And I think there's a lot of people, even people like this person, that would be traditionally opposed to U.S. military presence. I think that logic would hold for them as well, for a lot of people like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and it reminds me, I was recently in Indonesia, and I was talking to some people, or some people kind of brought up some of the discussions between, U.S. and China there, and making decisions about on the Indonesian side. It's I'm not going to go into the details because that's a whole other conversation. But like, they also articulated a similar sentiment where it was like, well, maybe I think for them, it was like, well, we kind of know how the U.S. tries to screw us over.
Right.
But they were concerned that China would almost be much worse, from their perspective, at least. Yeah, I guess in speaking of kind of the devil, this is a bit of an older base and has a bit of a longer history, but I also wanted to talk about the stuff in Okinawa in Japan, and maybe it might be helpful to kind of start giving a little bit of an overview of like some of the kind of, we'll say, tensions between the local community in Okinawa and the U.S. military base there, for anyone kind of not familiar with what's going on, giving a little bit of a high level.
Yeah, happy to. So I would say in my research, the Okinawan case sort of looms very large. This is a place I've been to several times, as I mentioned. I've done interviews there. I've seen the bases there. All these sorts of things. So there's a lot to say about this particular thing. I think what I'll sort of say in terms of a historical overview of this issue. Okinawa was at one point an independent kingdom, not part of Japan, called the Ryukyu Kingdom. It became part of Japan in 1879. There were all these policies of assimilation of the Okinawans. That was the name, of course, of the Japanese prefecture, was renamed this. And there's a lot to say about this specific history, but for the purposes of this discussion, really important thing to note was the Battle of Okinawa itself during World War II, which is, if you remember your World War II Pacific history, which I don't always remember immediately off the top of my head, this was one of the last major conflicts in specifically the Pacific War between the U.S. and Japan. And from the perspective of a lot of Okinawans, they were sort of abandoned by the Japanese military, and several survivors of this battle have said that we were told basically instead of getting captured that we need to kill ourselves, we need to commit suicide. So basically, at some point, they were left on their own to deal with the invading American force. The Americans came as a result of the clashes between the U.S. And Japan. About a third of the population of the Okinawan, I believe it's the entire prefecture, not just the main island of Okinawa, died here. After the end of World War II, we had a U.S. military government in the entirety of Japan, and also in Okinawa in particular. And we also had a lot of the land in Okinawa basically confiscated by the U.S. military and turned into U.S. military bases. So while the rest of Japan reverted basically to Japanese civilian rule in 1952 with the signing of the San Francisco Treaty, Okinawa itself remained under U.S. military government until 1972. Between when Okinawa initially became, under U.S. military government at the end of World War II, and 1972 when it became part of Japan again, there was a lot of unrest, a lot of protests against having U.S. military government. All these sorts of things, a very robust protest movement at that particular time. Part of it has to do with the way the land was confiscated. Part of this has to do with sort of this nationality identity issue, which we can talk more about. Basically, are we Japanese citizens? What kind of rights do we have as Japanese citizens? Or, should we be independent? Are we part of the U.S.? All these sorts of things. And then also at that time, a lot of crimes being committed by U.S. military personnel that have been documented by some groups there. So this is sort of the precursor to the protest movement that we've seen now in Okinawa. The modern protest movement in Okinawa against the U.S. military presence, I would say, really started in 1995, where we had a particularly heinous crime that was committed by 3 U.S. military personnel. There was a young girl that was kidnapped and sexually assaulted, unfortunately. So after this, we see a lot, as you can imagine, outrage, protests, civil society groups forming, focused on this specific issue about crimes related to the U.S. military and just generally, some of the negative things that can result from hosting a U.S. military presence. So one of the things that we saw as a result of this particular incident and also the reaction in Okinawa was a special action committee on Okinawa, SACO, formed by the U.S. and Japan to try to figure out how to alleviate some of these tensions in Okinawa. Some of you may know this. Okinawa actually has the largest proportion of U.S. military bases in Japan. It is a very relatively small territory, so there's a ton of U.S. bases there. So the reason I bring up the SACO piece is that one of the findings of this particular report was that they wanted to move this base, it's called the Marine Corps base. It's MCAS. I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but it's a Marine Corps activity, I think, station. Futenma, which is in the middle of Ginowan City in Okinawa. It is right up against a lot of different residence areas, stuff like this. So it's very close to where people are living, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of safety concerns about that. So one of the recommendations was actually to close this particular base and move the functions of this base to Hanoko, where there's already a U.S. military base, but they wanted to expand that particular base. They proposed this in 1996. This still has not been, this plan has still not come to fruition, in part because of a lot of local opposition to this particular plan. And I think from the Okinawan perspective, or especially the perspective of people who are opposed to this proposal, the problem, there's several problems. One of them is really about potentially environmental degradation as a result of the construction of this expansion. But I think the bigger issue is really about wanting to reduce the number of U.S. military bases and troops in Okinawa. And from their perspective, it's not enough to sort of move this base from this really highly densely populated metropolitan area in one city to Camp Schwab and Hanoko. We just want to close, one of these bases entirely. That is from their perspective. So that, I would say, is sort of the core of the Okinawan opposition and protest movement against the U.S. military there. Obviously, there's, a variety of different perspectives in any movement that we're talking about. Some people want it gone entirely. Others say, this particular issue is sort of the most important thing to deal with.
Yeah, this makes sense. I mean, how are people thinking about it now? Like, what have been the ways? There might be multiple different strategies or opinions, but kind of what's the pulse on people on how they have been, like, have the Okinawan people been able to kind of push for what they want, or has that just largely not been successful?
Yeah, this is a great question. So one of the things that I think is really unique about what we see in Okinawa, especially regarding I won't even say anti-base sentiment per se, but really against this particular proposal, is that you have a lot of Okinawan politicians, especially in the past, let's say a couple decades, mostly at the prefectural level. So prefecture in Japan is a U.S. state for us, or province for other places. So we've seen a lot of governors of Okinawa actually very explicitly take an anti-expansion of Camp Schwab stand. So they're really, supporting this position of some of these activists to say, we don't want this expansion here. We just want fewer U.S. bases. It's really interesting. I've interviewed people in the Okinawan prefectural government, not the governor per se, but bureaucrats that are there and other staff members. And there's actually literature coming from this office that is really about why these bases in general are a problem and why this specific base is a problem, and sort of the negative impacts of the military presence. To your question about how successful it's been in terms of really doing a whole lot about it, I would say first of all, the fact that this has taken so long. This started in 1996 with this Saco finding, and we're talking about this in 2026, so it's been about 30 years. I think in some sense that is, speaks to really the success in some ways of activists in raising this problems with this particular proposal. We've seen them, and we've seen local politicians ask for environmental assessments where they felt like this was not done as thoroughly as it should be. They've gone through other venues to try to get some of these issues resolved. One of the really interesting things that I've read about and talked to people about is they filed actually a court case with the Ninth District Court in the U.S. saying that the Department of Defense at the time actually, violated something that Japan had said was part of Japan's national heritage, which is the dugong. This is this like sea creature that lives in the waters around Okinawa that is endangered. It's sort of like a manatee. It's kind of similar to what we think of when we think about what a manatee looks like. So they pursue these sort of things through various legal channels, including, in the U.S., as they said, a lot of other different ways. There've been referenda on some of these issues. But that being said, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on who you talk to about this particular issue, the Japanese government seems very keen on going forward with this plan. I mean, I think from their perspective, they've probably sunk so many resources into this construction, and it's probably just going to go forward as is. And I'm sure there's also concerns about what kind of precedent it could set if they say, okay, never mind, we don't want to do this. But so far, we haven't really seen them acquiesce too much to what Okinawans are asking for. And I think this is also another important point about, this communal level analysis when we're thinking about understanding what communities can do or not do in terms of if they're having a foreign military presence in their community. When you think about what they're there for, what these bases in the case of Japan and basing access in the case of the Philippines are there in the country for, ostensibly this is about host nation security, right? I mean, this is also a benefit to the U.S. as well, but this is also part of the calculus of politicians in actually protecting the host nation. So in this sense, this sort of security policy is really decided at the national level. Mm-hmm. So in a lot of cases, there's really not a whole lot of voice that local governments have or can impact in terms of change. But there are other ways outside of these sort of, we think about routinized politics that governments and activists try to use, like the ones I was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this makes sense. With with your point about with the dugongs, I think maybe that's a playbook some of the people in the Philippines should look to too, because like for example in Palawan there are also dugongs there. There's a pretty significant population, and if I'm understanding correctly, there's a significant population of dugongs in southern Philippines too. So maybe they should maybe they could also use that for, I guess, a form of resistance too. But yeah, I mean, what you're saying, yeah, this is another the element. What you're talking about at the end was another element that seemed kind of complicated in Okinawa, and I mean, admittedly, like in the U.S., we also tend to, the federal government deals with foreign policy, so like a state can't decide foreign policy even if that involves hurting a state, but I guess how what yeah, so you have the Okinawan people. It seems like the Okinawan people, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it seems like the Okinawan people are concerned, or not everyone, but there are many Okinawan people who don't necessarily like the presence of this base, and that might have a pretty significant influence in Okinawan politics in in that area. But the national government is pretty solidly in favor of the U.S. By national here, I mean Japan. The Japanese government is pretty in favor of having a presence there. But then, if the governor will say, I don't know the particular stance of the governor right at this moment in Okinawa, but if he or she sides with the activists and is like, no, we need to minimize bases, we need to kick people out, whatever. um, like, is there a way that they can kind of influence the national stage? Um, and then also, like you were saying at the wee beginning, it seems like Okinawans, they're they're kind of different than the rest of the Japanese people. Like they used to be independent, and I bet this idea of, well, if the Japanese government is kind of imposing bases on us, how does it play into that mentality about how they think about the Japanese government and maybe even Japaneseness?
These are great questions. Yeah, so let me take actually the last one first. I think this is a huge part of it. As I said, I think from the Okinawan perspective, part of what we've seen is the fact that they have really a disproportionate number of U.S. bases there. And if you've ever been to Okinawa, I've been able to drive there a couple of times, like not actually driving to Okinawa, but in Okinawa. And you just see so many bases. Everywhere you go, they're there, and you can see them very, very clearly. So I think from the Okinawan perspective, there's sort of, this notion that these bases are a form of discrimination. I've had someone actually come out and say this in an interview. It's not fair for Okinawa to actually really have to bear so much of the base burden in Japan, especially compared to other prefectures in the Japanese mainland. So I definitely think that they feel like the bases themselves having to host them, and like we were just talking about, showing that there's a not insignificant proportion of the population. And I think in some polls that have been done in Okinawa the past couple of years, I want to say maybe 2010s or maybe even more recently, they've been opposed to this particular base that we were just talking about in Hanoko, and to have nothing really happening in terms of the national government. The national government's still saying we're still going to do it. I think that also goes to this feeling of discrimination vis-a-vis not just the Japanese government, but also mainland Japan. So I think that all helps foster this, as you said, sort of sense of Okinawanness. I'm starting to work on my book manuscript, which will be based on the sort of dissertation work that I've been talking about here. But that's one of the things that I'm hoping to look at a lot more. But I do think there is sort of this distinct sense of Okinawan identity that is separate from Japanese identity. And I do think there's a lot of Okinawans, in part, as I said, because of this issue, that really, sort of view themselves as Okinawan first, and maybe Japanese citizen after that. And I think, as I say, the base issues really exacerbate that and really don't help sort of create more of a unified Japanese national identity across Japanese mainland and Okinawa. So yeah, 100%. This is a really big problem. Yeah, the question about can the governors or the Okinawan government really do anything? They have tried in a variety of different ways. In 2013, we had sort of the beginning of what's called the All Okinawa movement. So this was not just activists that have focused on this issue for a long time, but also politicians in Okinawa and the governor at the time really wanting to draw attention to this issue and trying to do something about it. So they went to the national government to try to, get them to actually change their minds. They actually came to the U.S., to D.C., to try to talk to, not just, I don't know if they actually talked to the Obama at the time or the vice president, but I know that they've talked to different senators and other members of Congress, trying to do something about this particular issue as well. So we really haven't seen a whole lot, unfortunately. being able to be done in that way. What we did have sort of interesting in 1995, we had a governor, Masahide Ota, at that time. So the background to what I'm about to say is that the U.S. bases in Okinawa, a lot of them anyway, are on privately owned land. So de facto what has happened is these landowners periodically have given permission, sort of, imply that you really need to be doing this on behalf of the Japanese government, to give the U.S. military permission to continue to be on their land. And so what Masahide Ota did at this particular time was really encourage people to say, no, we're not going to give, we're not going to give the U.S. military permission to be on this land anymore. We're revoking this permission. And so they did. And ultimately, again, unfortunately, from the activist perspective, the same sort of story. We didn't really see any change, but it definitely, was something that this governor tried to do, and it created some headaches for the Japanese government at that particular time. The last thing I'll also say about this that you might find interesting, one of the people that I was able to interview in Japan was actually the former Prime Minister Hatoyama Yukio, who, if some of you remember, was the Prime Minister that took office in 2009. He was part of the Democratic Party of Japan, which is not the primary party that is typically elected into office there, that being, of course, the Liberal Democratic Party, or the LDP. And one of the platforms that Hatoyama had run on was actually trying to get these, at least lessen some of the burden of the bases in Okinawa, and specifically to stop construction of this particular base that I've been talking about in Hanoko. Ultimately, because of pressure from the U.S., because of, I think, opposition within the Japanese government, he was not able to do this. So, he left office, I think, 2 years after he was elected, so that was actually a pretty short time, and part of it was because of this particular issue and not being able to deliver. So this is all to say that even when you have a national leader that is really empathetic to these things, that's not necessarily going to make a whole lot of difference either. Again, unfortunately, depending on your perspective on these things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, this is interesting. It's interesting to think about how, it, you know, like I think when we often think about U.S. interests and U.S. bases and this and that, we can often over focus on like what are their military goals and how does this kind of play in the kind of big picture powers between the nations. But like, I think we often forget about how the presence of these bases impact people there. And it seems like, to be honest, they're in like, especially in a case like Okinawa, they're not given due consideration. It seems like they are just, both Japan and the U.S. kind of write off that area as, this is the right place to set up interest to kind of win chess games against, geopolitical games against, Russia and China. So before the USSR, maybe now more China, but like, it's a key place in kind of in relation to both those countries, also North Korea.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, what I guess I'm gonna ask a final question. It's a bit of a broad kind of reflective question, but what do you see as like, as you've done this research on these bases and also how local communities and how the people in the countries in question receive the bases. Like, what have you learned about maybe humanity or societies in terms of like um what has this kind of taught you about how uh politics is done, or whatever there could be so many different angles, but yeah, I guess broadly speaking, um what has this taught you about how humans work?
What a great question. I would say that, the first thing that I would say, the first sort of thought when you were asking this question, just how resilient people are. I mean, in this particular movement, as I was just talking about, this has been going on, at least, for the past 30 years, but the Okinawan, movement against having all these military bases here, that's been going on, for decades. And the fact that we still have, people, even though they're not really making a lot of, progress, arguably, in terms of actually, getting this construction to stop or actually removing these bases. I find that really inspiring from a human perspective, and I think as I said, I study protests, and specifically these types of protests, but protests in general. And I think that, so many times when I think about power, we think so much about governmental institutions and, like the military. And of course, this is not to say that, they don't have enormous amounts of power. They obviously, do, but we also as, individual people, and as collectively working together, we also have so much power to do a lot. And I think sometimes we forget that. I think especially in the U.S., we forget that all the time. And we're seeing this with some of the protests in the U.S. That the power that people can have. So I think that's a lot of it as well. I think, one of the things I'll say also is, as I mentioned when I've interviewed activists in particular, they're, there's obviously they're opposed to certain aspects of having a U.S. military presence in their community or their country in some cases, but they're also really empathetic, I would say, to the fact that, soldiers are people. They're just deployed to a certain place. They have families. They're not necessarily bad people because of what they're doing in terms of being in the military. So I think that's also something really, a really important point to note as well. Just the capacity for empathy that so many people have in places we might not expect it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think both are very real. I think, there's power in protest, but there's also specifically power in, I guess you could say, long-term protest. Sometimes resilience is just staying so you can fight another day because you never know when the winds might change. Um, and also, so there's sometimes that kind of long term actually has some of the biggest meaningful impacts. And I have talked to other people in other different kind of talking about other different, I guess you could say, other struggles around the world where it's a sometimes it's like resilience is a, yes, it seems like everything is out to get us, but we're surviving, and we'll continue to survive. Um, but also with the second part, I mean, yeah, like big systems, and there can be a lot of bad, but like, soldiers are people, and they're often individual people, and they um whatever impact the military bases are having, um they're still people, and people can be very nice and hospitable and like great to talk to. Yeah, it can be important to both understand that, and I think it can be helpful to see that too, and to kind of understand that, even in like, um, like like I mean, maybe even now, like even in more evil systems, sometimes the people there who are working for it even are people too, and they can get kind of, they probably don't conceive of what they're doing as bad, but like they're still people and have stories and can be related to, and that doesn't detract from the fact of what's happening, but sometimes we have to hold both at the same time. Um, I guess one other quick thing for anyone interested in learning more about your work, where would you recommend they go? And I guess that's both current work that's up, and you've also kind of referenced like a book, manuscript, and a book that's coming out. So I guess that's both present and future work.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. So my website, cmwillis.com, has a lot of information about the stuff I'm working on. I would say that's probably the best place. You can sort of see the different types of articles that I've published, and then also things I have in progress. As I said, I have the BRIC project, which I'm really looking at the communal level and some of the communities I talked about, Okinawa being a key one that I'm talking about. I'll also talk about Palawan that I mentioned in the Philippines there as well. I have some other cool projects, I think, on bases that are coming out. So check out my website. This is a good place to find information about all of those things.
There you go. Yeah. And maybe maybe kind of keep an eye on it, because you have your book coming out too. Do you know have you decided what the title will be, or are you not there yet? Oh no.
Ooh, so sorry. My dog is very unhappy that we have a repair person here. So I have a tentative title, which is it's Haunted by the Past, and I cannot remember what the other part of the title is, but that is the first part of the title. So it's really in this particular book, what I'm wanting to look at is really the ways that activists use historical trauma to frame things that are happening in the present, and by doing so, they sort of, number one, render a certain narrative of things that have happened in the past. So in the case of Okinawa, I talk about the Battle of Okinawa as one of those things. This is something that is referenced when activists are talking about why it's a problem to have this base construction going on and to have all these other military bases. And then also it's really about sort of, as we talked about, creating this, in some cases, very distinctive identity that is local and not necessarily a national identity. So basically using this sort of historical trauma to make sense of what's happening now and to continue sort of building localized solidarity. So I look at this in Okinawa, I look at this in Palawan, as I mentioned, which is an interesting case in a lot of ways. I also look at Jeju, South Korea, which is the southernmost island there, and very similar in a lot of ways to Okinawa, except the base there is officially a Korean naval base, but unsurprisingly, the U.S. has also used this as well.
Interesting. Okay, I have been to Jeju, and I wasn't aware that there was a base. It's not the largest island in the world. Like it's a kind of a small island. I just didn't even notice it. Maybe I even drove past it and just didn't even know I was in a base. But this is cool. I'm glad that you're publishing this work, and thanks for taking the time now to talk. And I hope you have a good rest of your time with Repairman and your dog and everything.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about this work.